issues, the environmental issues, and the importance of consultations. And I think that through our process, what we have seen is for the first time in over 10 years, where we've actually had pipelines that have been approved to tidewaters. And I think that is of great significance because that is something in which we have not seen, and that's something in which has benefited not only the province of Alberta, but as has been pointed out by my colleagues, other colleagues, it benefits the entire country, both directly and indirectly. And I'm wondering if my colleague would not agree that the current approach at developing and getting pipelines done is the right approach.
Member for Caribou, Prince George.
Well, Mr. Speaker, if you'll indulge me just a second to finish my question or my answer to the earlier question. Clearly, the Conservatives stand up for making sure that jobs and creating jobs in Canada is so important, not just good quality jobs or high-paying jobs. But to our colleague across the way, Mr. Speaker, making announcements are great. Getting shovels in the ground and getting projects up and running is another thing. This government has shown over the last 2 years they're great at making fluffy announcements. When the tires hit the pavement, where are they? There's not a lot of shovels in the ground, Mr. Speaker. And what we're talking about today is having the Prime Minister and his 17 members of Parliament from British Columbia stand up in the House and at home in British Columbia and sell this project and promote it and support it.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Quebec-Mactaquac.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm honoured to be able to say that I'll be splitting my time with my honourable colleague from Surrey Centre. Mr. Speaker, this government believes that economic growth and protecting our environment go hand in hand. Canadians have told us that this is what we need to do to address climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emissions while promoting economic prosperity across the country. The Government of Canada is taking steps to do just that by lessening our reliance on fossil fuels, introducing a price on carbon pollution, and investing in the clean energy economy of tomorrow. In the meantime, we need to make responsible decisions about energy, the energy we use, and how we move our energy resources safely to the global market. As a rural member from Atlantic Canada, I recognize the importance of the natural resource sector and the preservation, along with the preservation, enhancement, and quality of Canada's natural environment, which includes protecting water, air, soil, flora, and fauna. I would like to speak to some of the environmental protection elements that are part of our pipeline plan that we have recently announced. I am pleased to say that our new pipeline plan has a number of strong environmental protections in place. Our ability to meet our greenhouse gas commitments will not be hindered, species at risk will be protected, pipeline and marine safety will be improved, and the pristine wilderness of British Columbia's north coast will be protected. We assessed the greenhouse gas issues related to these projects and have factored them into our decision. Greenhouse gas emissions from operations and construction of both pipelines will not be significant. With respect to the Trans Mountain Expansion Project, the National Energy Board has added conditions to the project certificate to mitigate some of the emissions related to the construction of the pipeline. Environment and Climate Change Canada has estimated the greenhouse gases related to the production and processing of the oil that will be transported by the pipelines, referred to as upstream emissions. These will be regulated through the province of Alberta's Climate Action Plan and its 100 megaton cap on greenhouse gas emissions from oil sands development. Meeting our 2030 targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions will require action from all sectors, including all levels of government and the oil and gas industry. We are working together with the provinces and territories to develop a pan-Canadian framework for clean growth and climate change. In developing this framework, we have actively considered how we collectively do more to reduce greenhouse gases. For example, our government announced last week regulations to cut methane emissions from oil and gas operations by 40 to 45% by 2025. Our government has put in place a pan-Canadian approach to pricing carbon pollution as a central element of this plan. Pricing carbon pollution is one of the most efficient ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, drive innovation, and encourage people and businesses to pollute less. Future oil and gas production levels will depend on how producers respond to carbon policies and corresponding market signals, what technological advancements are made, and the ability of companies to compete in an increasingly carbon-constrained world. We are confident in our industry's capacity to innovate, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and compete in the emerging global low-carbon economy. With all these factors in place, the government believes that the pipeline project does not impact our plan to meet or exceed our 2030 emissions reduction targets of 30% below 2005 levels. The Trans Mountain Pipeline will pass through the ranges of some herds of the southern mountain caribou, which the Species at Risk Act considers to be threatened. The National Energy Board imposed 6 conditions to ensure that there is no net loss of caribou habitat. Environment and Climate Change Canada will work with the National Energy Board to assist the proponent in meeting these conditions. Furthermore, construction will be timed to avoid disrupting the mating and migration of the southern mountain caribou. The government has worked with the province of British Columbia on a study to review the protections in place for southern mountain caribou and encourage their recovery. The government will not hesitate to take additional action if required to mitigate the potential impacts that could result from the specific projects on the affected southern mountain caribou herd. The government is committed to the protection and recovery of Canada's southern resident killer whales, listed as endangered under the Species at Risk Act. The primary threat to this species' survival and recovery and environmental contamination, reductions in availability or quality of prey, and acoustic disturbance. Before any shipping from the Trans Mountain Expansion Project begins, the Government of Canada is committed to advancing work in key areas to reduce its impacts on this population. The objective is to mitigate the impact of additional Trans Mountain Expansion marine traffic before the project begins its operations. The Government of Canada, with the help of its partners, is putting in place a strong Southern Resident Killer Whale Action Plan to promote recovery. The plan will significantly reduce the impact of noise from marine vessels on killer whales through voluntary and regulatory measures. It will ensure that there is sufficient food available for whales and reduce the pressure on the whale population from persistent contaminants. With Line 3, Enbridge will be required to ensure that the project does not create a net loss to wetland areas, as wetlands are not only vital habitat for migratory birds, but they also provide an important ecosystem services such as flood prevention and water purification. In addition to habitat protection and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, we are making transport of petroleum products safer. The recently announced Oceans Protection Plan is designed to achieve a world-leading marine safety system for our country's unique context that will increase our government's capacity to prevent and improve its response to marine oil spills. The Pipeline Safety Act, which came into force in June of 2016, strengthens Canada's pipeline safety system by enshrining the polluters pay principle into law. In terms of specific safety measures, Enbridge's Line 3 replacement will have new, thicker pipeline in many sections and will be built to modern specifications that will enhance the safety and integrity of the network and will further protect the environment from potential spills. Furthermore, a number of additional safety features are included in the Line 3 replacement project. For example, the installation of 26 remotely operated sectioning valves near waterways to allow pipeline to be shut off quickly if necessary. The biggest environmental protection initiative that we have put into place in our pipeline plan is a moratorium on tankers carrying crude oil and persistent oil products. The tanker moratorium provides an unprecedented level of environmental protection from the Great Bear Rainforest and ensures British Columbia's northern coastline, which are integral to the livelihood and cultures of Indigenous and coastal communities. The Great Bear Rainforest and Sea, which stretches for more than 400 kilometres along British Columbia's northern coast, is home to several Indigenous and coastal communities, as well as a spectacular variety of fish, marine mammals, and wildlife. The tanker moratorium will help to ensure that this area is preserved for future generations. Mr. Speaker, the sensitive ecosystems of the Douglas Channel, which is part of the Great Bear Sea, is no place for 220 tankers to be transiting annually. For this reason, we have directed the National Energy Board to dismiss the Northern Gateway Pipeline project application because it is not in the best public interests of Canadians. In the case of the Northern Gateway, the proposed economic development was not consistent with our principles of environmental protection. Mr. Speaker, in coming to these decisions and in developing this plan, the government has reviewed thousands of pages of scientific evidence, held hundreds of consultation sessions across the country, and specifically in British Columbia with Indigenous peoples, and heard from thousands of Canadians. We have listened, and we are confident that our overall plan maps out a path forward that is consistent with both growing the economy and protecting the environment. I would like to further add that, this is a government that has spent a significant amount of time and resources meeting with stakeholders, meeting with Indigenous communities, meeting with environmentalists, and taking all those factors into account as we make our decisions, because we need to ensure that we're not sacrificing the environment for the sake of a project or vice versa. And I think we've achieved a great deal of progress over the last year and a half. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I would like to conclude my remarks today. I thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Kootenay, Columbia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech today. People of British Columbia, including people in my riding, are very concerned about Kinder Morgan pipeline for some very good reasons. First of all, they talk about a flawed environmental assessment process, and that's been confirmed by a couple of expert reports recently. They believe that pipelines are old thinking, that we need to be moving towards a green future, a green energy economy, which keeps jobs locally rather than outside of our communities. That there's no consent from several First Nations along the route, which speaks to whether or not the government is truly interested in reconciliation. And it'll create a seven-fold increase in the risk of a catastrophic oil spill on the BC coast, and the cost of one oil spill will far outweigh any long-term benefits for British Columbians. So given those very strong, very important concerns, I'd like to hear what my colleague's response is to the people of British Columbia that really care about those things. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Tabik-Mactaquac.
Well, I thank my honourable colleague for his question, and I 100% respect his arguments. And I think what he's speaking to here is he's really speaking to the plan that we've put in place. And the reason he's speaking to that is because it speaks to the tremendous amount of consultation that we've had with Indigenous communities, with Indigenous stakeholders, with communities on the BC coast. It speaks to our Oceans Protection Plan. It speaks to the changes that we've made to the environmental assessment process and to the changes that we plan to make in the future in order to best represent our constituents in a given area that could be affected adversely with the building of any project. But I think what's important to recognize are the tremendous gains that we've made as a government over the last 15 or 16 months in terms of ensuring and enshrining the rights of Canadians, especially in geographic areas where there are proposed projects going on. I know for myself, there's projects going on in New Brunswick and across Atlantic Canada as well, and Atlantic Canadians have the same concerns as British Columbians. And I think it's important that we recognize the tremendous work that this government has done and will continue to do to ensure that all those stakeholders are properly consulted and that they play an integral part in the process and approval of any project.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To my honourable colleague from Tabik-Mactaquac, with all due respect, as a member of Parliament for Saanich Gulf Islands, where my constituents are overwhelmingly against this project, where I intervened before the National Energy Board on their behalf, I went through all 23,000 pages of so-called evidence from Kinder Morgan. I'm going to tell you without a shadow of a doubt that most of what's being claimed in this House is nonsense. There was no rigorous review. There was no rigorous science. And what science exists was rejected by the National Energy Board is coming too late in the process and therefore unfair to Kinder Morgan to accept the overwhelming evidence that bitumen mixed with diluent cannot be cleaned up. So having a wonderful so-called world-class oil spill response program is a nonsense when there is no technology known by science, including Canada's premier scientific academy, the Royal Society of Canada, to deal with a substance that separates in a marine environment the bitumen sinking, the volatile diluents, which include benzene, which is cancer-causing, entering the atmosphere. We literally have no technology to clean this stuff up. So my question to my honourable friend from New Brunswick is, would he be willing, and would the federal government and the federal Liberals be willing to wait so that a decent, rigorous environmental review can be done by the government of British Columbia?
The honourable member for Tavik-Mactaquac.
Well, I thank my honourable colleague for her question, and I completely 100% respect her concerns. And I think what's important about the environment we have here in this House is we have a centre here where we can have robust discussions about a variety of topics, recognizing that we're not always going to completely 100% agree with each other's opinions. And I don't completely agree with my honourable colleague's opinions, and the reason why is because we have done our due diligence. We have recognized the potential of this project, given its merits. We have taken into consideration the effects on Indigenous communities. We have consulted with Indigenous communities. We have consulted with the people of British Columbia. And the National Energy Board has done their due diligence. They've approved this project, and I think it's our responsibility to respect that decision and recognize the economic potential that we could have from this project while taking into consideration the effects on the environment and the communities in that area. And I'm really proud to say that I'm part of a government that's taken those into consideration. You know, I sit on the Natural Resources Committee with one of her honourable, honourable colleagues from both sides of the House, and we've had robust discussions over the last year about the process, about consulting with Canadians and Indigenous communities. And I'm happy to say that I think that within our committee, we've come to a lot of general agreements across party lines. And I think that that really speaks not only to the strength of this government and our approach, but also to the strength of committees. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Surrey Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm happy to rise in the House to address this motion. As a British Columbian, someone who cares about our coast, our environment, and our economy, I'd like to talk about the implications for our coastlines of natural resource projects such as the one being discussed today. Canada has the longest coastline in the world, tens of thousands of kilometers of beaches and shoals, cliffs and forests, glaciers and grassland, cities and villages. Our coastline is home to fisheries. It draws Canadians and tourists who come to play, to challenge themselves, or to relax and reflect. It allows our businesses to trade with other countries of the world in emerging and established markets. It supports traditional, Indigenous, and coastal communities' livelihoods. Our coasts help define the Canadian experience and power the Canadian economy. I have had numerous constituents speak to me about this matter, some for it and some against it. It is therefore vitally important for Canada that we protect our maritime environments, that our waters and coastlines remain clean, safe, and accessible, and that we continue to sustain communities while growing our economies. To this end, in November 2016, the Prime Minister introduced Canadians to the Oceans Protection Plan, a plan that will safeguard our communities and our coastlines and marine environment. The plan, developed in collaboration with Transport Canada, Department of Fisheries and Oceans, the Canadian Coast Guard, Environment and Climate Change Canada, and Natural Resources Canada, reflects and relies on scientific evidence to safeguard our maritime environment. It puts priority on co-management with Indigenous Canadians, and it responds to Canadians' desire to better protect the coastal environment that is central to our way of life. We are putting $1.5 billion into this plan, the largest investment of its kind ever made in our coasts and waterways. This plan will create a world-leading marine safety system, including new preventative and response measures to better protect our waters and coasts. Safety is the top priority of this plan. In Canada, we already have a strong marine safety record, but with this new plan, Canada will have a truly world-leading system for marine protection and emergency preparedness. To that end, we are going to ensure the Canadian Coast Guard has the tools it needs.
Order. The honourable member for Cariboo Prince George on a point of order.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker, and I rise on an order of relevance. Mr. Speaker, we're here talking about a motion with respect to Kinder Morgan and the Prime Minister, and indeed his 17 BC MPs standing up in support of it. And our honourable colleague has, for the last 4 minutes, gone on about the Oceans Protection Plan. Nothing, hasn't mentioned once about the motion regarding Kinder Morgan. Thank you.
I thank the honourable member for his intervention. I'm cognizant of the fact that the honourable member for Surrey Centre is only 3 minutes into his remarks, and agreeably is on a topic that is perhaps not direct, but certainly indirectly a part of today's discussion in respect to the shipments of petroleum products as it relates to the motion that's before the House. So I'm sure the honourable member will be invoking these subjects through the course of his speech and bring it around to the relevance to the motion that's in front of the House this afternoon. So the honourable, is it on the same point of order?
Point of order.
Okay, so we'll leave the intervention by the member for Caribou Prince George, and now we have a point of order from the honourable member for Tebeke-Mactaquac.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I just wanted to rise for a second on a point of order related to the comments reflected by the honourable member across the aisle. And the reason I want to raise this point of order is because I find it extremely disrespectful that in the middle of a speech by my honourable colleague, who is from British Columbia, who is here representing the 17 MPs from British Columbia, who is representing the thoughts and concerns of British Columbians, he stands up and cuts him off in the middle of his speech for no apparent reason. You know, I'm really disconcerted by that, and I have the utmost respect for my honourable colleague, and I don't understand that. So I wish that he would retract his comments. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I thank the honourable member for his intervention, and certainly points of order are in order when members believe that there has been some type of infraction as it relates to the standing orders. Points of order can be raised even in the midst of other members' remarks. That is in order, and the difficulty is, from the chair occupant's point of view, is that one has to actually hear the point of order before one can really make a determination on whether, in fact, it pertains or is relevant to the matter at hand. So we've done that, and I appreciate the member for Tebeke-Mactaquac's additional comments on the matter. I think it is closed at this point, and we'll get back to the honourable member for Surrey Centre and his remarks. The honourable member for Surrey Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'll continue on, and we'll see at the end if my fellow colleague is still concerned about the topic. To that end, we are going to ensure the Canadian Coast Guard has the tools it needs to save lives and better protect our waterways. That means more vessels to enhance search and rescue capability, more rescue stations, better communication gears, and more towing capacity, so the Canadian Coast Guard is able to respond more quickly and effectively. It also means enhancing the Coast Guard's ability to take the lead as part of any coordinated response to an incident or event. Additionally, we will be extending the role of the Coast Guard Auxiliary to include environmental response functions. To further enhance safety in Canadian waters and along its shores, we will provide improved marine safety and navigation information, including hydrography and charting, to mariners, Indigenous peoples, and coastal communities. And we will invest in leading-edge research on oil spill cleanup technologies. Our goal is to keep Canadian waters free of damaging accidents. Our new safety measures will take us further in that direction. Our government will also examine how we can improve cleanup technology, how best to mitigate impacts, and how to encourage ecological recovery. In addition, we are going to get tough on business and industries that pollute along our coast. When it comes to oil spills, we already have in place a comprehensive system of liability and compensation, but we're going to improve it. We will ensure that unlimited compensation is available to those affected by a spill. We are also going to better address the risks posed by other types of hazardous and noxious substances transported by ships. With these measures brought forward, Canada will become a world leader in polluter-pays ship source liability and compensation. The OPP addresses the concerns we heard from Canadians on marine safety, including during reviews of natural resource projects, where marine shipping is needed to move goods to international markets. In addition, as part of our plan, the government is developing a strong set of actions to implement the recovery plan for the southern resident killer whale. Substantive new actions will be developed and implemented to address the main stressors impeding the recovery of the southern resident killer whale population, including reduce the impact of noise from marine vessels and killer whales, ensure there is sufficient food availability for whales, and reduce the pressure on the whale population from persistent contaminants. Further strengthening our partnership with Indigenous and coastal communities is a key element of the OPP and its success. Our coasts are the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples. We are committed to taking a real and tangible step toward co-management of our coastlines to ensure they remain healthy, clean, and safe for generations to come. In particular, the traditional knowledge and expertise of Canada's Indigenous people is critical to protecting our coastal waters more effectively. Coastal Indigenous communities will have real opportunities to be partners in the marine safety regime. They will be offered training in search and rescue missions, environmental monitoring, and emergency spill response. The government will work with Indigenous partners to create regional response plans for the West Coast, and we will pursue shared leadership opportunities in other areas, such as the creation of local vessel control areas to help minimize safety risks and environmental impacts. Our government is dedicated to further integrating Indigenous groups into the decision-making process as it relates to our marine environment. As a trading nation, as a country that is open to the world, our coastlines are essential to our economy. We are a nation that balances the economy, growth, and the environment, and we do this without compromise. We make decisions based on independent scientific evidence, not pitting one region against the other. These are hard decisions, but in this case, it's the right decision. Our government has imposed 157 conditions, stringent and strong conditions that will ensure the project complies to the highest safety environment standards in the world. We understand that Canadian jobs depend on our ability to access and serve the markets of Asia and Europe. That's how many of our commodities reach buyers around the world. By working together with our partners along the coast and across the country, we can preserve our coastlines for generations to come, address concerns including pipeline safety and climate change, and grow our economy and create jobs. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Central Okanagan, Similkameen Nicola.
Mr. Speaker, it's certainly welcome to hear another BC voice, particularly from the government side, that is actually speaking about in terms of the importance of pipelines, although it seemed to be more on the environmental front looking after that, and that's an important part of it. Mr. Speaker, I would just ask the honourable member, does he feel that he and his colleagues are also speaking to people throughout British Columbia? As you know, the New Democrats have continued to raise concerns around it. Some may be founded, some may be well-founded, I should say. Some, to me, I don't believe are credible. However, that we live in a democracy. Does this member believe that he and his fellow Liberal BC MPs should be getting out and explaining exactly why this is in the natural interest?
Honourable member for Surrey Centre.
Mr. Speaker, thank you for the question from my fellow British Columbian. We have had town halls on climate change. We have had consultations more than any other government has ever had. My caucus members from British Columbia have had hundreds and hundreds of meetings with their constituents. Thousands have attended those. Safety and security of our maritime coastlines, our commodities to get to market is a primary concern, and we've done that in balance. Our members of Parliament have been vocal, have been strong proponents to ensure that we have a balance, and we have done this without a vacuum. We've not done this in a silo. We've done that to make sure that we have jobs, we have a growth in our economy, we encourage and increase more middle-class jobs, and we do this all while we protect the environment, all while we protect the coastlines, and all while we protect our marine life. Thank you.
Some comments. The honourable member for Kootenay, Columbia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the honourable member for his speech today, but he's left me a little confused because building the Kinder Morgan pipeline will increase oil tanker traffic 7-fold in the Salish Sea and through the Gulf Islands. So how will a 7-fold increase in tanker traffic help protect BC's coastline and the resident killer whale population?
Member for Surrey Centre.
So we are doing, thank you for the good question from my colleague. The Oceans Protection Plan does just that. It's spending $1.5 billion to have more radar stations along the coast, to have more sensitivity and noise monitoring of vessels that are going past killer whale pods, ensuring that their inhabited areas are protected. So we are doing that while we are increasing the ability to take commodities to tidewater and to open markets. So we're doing that in a balanced way. We are increasing the amount of funding that has been lax, has been delayed for such a long time. We are increasing the amount of tugs that will escort these ships going out to the open seas. They are all piloted when they come in. So there is a very high standard of monitoring, of escorts, and of hydrography to ensure that these ships go through safe passage.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Simple question for my colleague. He talked about evidence-based decision-making, but the government's process for pipeline approvals is actually, by definition, not evidence-based because they allow Cabinet to overrule decisions of the independent NEB. The NEB's job is to review the evidence and come forward with a recommendation. But for instance, on Energy East, the government has said they will not necessarily approve that project even if the NEB finds that, in fact, the evidence points to approval. So I wonder if the member is in favor of evidence-based decision-making, why he thinks politicians responding to non-scientific, purely political forces should be overruling decisions made based on evidence by the independent NEB, and why they did that with respect to the Northern Gateway pipeline.
For Surrey Centre.
Well, the member opposite might be reminiscent. The previous government made decisions almost solely based on political decisions without any regard to scientific evidence. Our government does it based on scientific evidence, and our cabinet reserves the right where they need to. But in this case, they have protected the integrity of the independent scientific evidence, and it's based solely on that all the decisions have been made. And I'm very proud of our government and our cabinet and our prime minister, who has made the right decisions to balance the economy and the environment based on evidence and not based on politicking. Thank you.
J'ai l'honneur d'informer.
I have the honor to inform you that a message has been received. June 1st, 2017. Mr. Speaker, I have the honor to inform you that Ms. Patricia Jaton, Deputy Secretary to the Governor General, in her capacity as Deputy of the Governor General, signified royal assent by written declaration to the bill listed in the schedule to this letter on the first day of June 2017 at 11 a.m. Yours sincerely, Stephen Wallace.
Annex.
Annex. Or rather, schedule, bill assented to, an act to implement the free trade agreement between Canada and Ukraine, Bill C-31.
Honor to inform the House that a communication has been received as follows. Mr. Speaker, I have the honor to inform you that Ms. Patricia Jaton, Deputy Secretary to the Governor-General, in her capacity as Deputy of the Governor-General, signed royal assent by written declaration to the bill listed in the schedule to this letter on the first day of June 2017 at 11 a.m. And that's signed by Stephen Wallace. And in the annex, the bill assented to this day was an act to implement the free trade agreement between Canada and Ukraine, Bill C-31. Resuming debate, reprise de débat, the honourable member for Peace River, Westlock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure to rise to speak to this topic today, and I'll be sharing my time with the member from Megantic-Al-Arable. Butchered it, I'm sure. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to just read the motion as it's been put forward here, put forward by Mr. Scheer, that the House agree that the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Expansion Project has a social license to proceed, is critical to the Canadian economy and the creation of thousands of jobs, is safe and environmentally sound, and is recognized and accepted by the National Energy Board, is under federal jurisdiction with respect to approval and regulation, and should be constructed with the continued support of the federal government, as demonstrated by the Prime Minister personally on announcing the approval of the project. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to just address a number of the points that we've laid out in this motion. I'm particularly going to focus my comments at the beginning of my speech on the idea of social license, and that this project has social license to proceed.
Hear, hear.
Without a doubt, Mr. Speaker, this project has public support. Now, the Prime Minister often talks about social license. This concept has different meanings depending on who you talk to. So I would like to just go through and outline what I think that social license means. The term is a relatively new term, and it was coined in 1990 by a mining executive named Jim Cooney in the 1990s. He suggested that social license is a subtle approval that runs parallel to governmental regulatory process. So it seems that social license is required for all projects to go forward, regardless of whether they've been officially approved. The minister points this out, that when the regulatory process has been successfully completed, he then politically will decide whether it has social license to go forward. The National Energy Board released its report on the Kinder Morgan pipeline twinning on May 19, 2016. They also had already approved the Northern Gateway pipeline as well, but for some reason one has been approved and the other one is continuing to, or has not been approved to go forward. So it's been interesting to see. One of the things that I think is important for the concept of social license is the idea of what is I guess it's more the moral question of whether these things should go forward. So if it's illegal for these things to go forward, is it moral for these things to go forward? And I guess the question that we're looking at in terms of this pipeline is what does this pipeline mean for the world in terms of, is it a good thing or a bad thing? Mr. Speaker, I'll argue that it is a good thing. Petroleum products are a big part of all of our lives. In fact, I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for petroleum products. I flew here from northern Alberta. I drove down to Edmonton in my car. I got on an airplane and I flew here from Edmonton, Alberta to Ottawa. And that is due to the exceptional development of our natural resource, petroleum products. The fuel that's used to fuel the jet, the fuel that's used in my car, allows me to get here in a relatively easy amount of time and allows me to go back and forth. And I think that that is a good thing. The fuel that is used in a tractor allows modern farming to produce food, more food than we can consume. In fact, Mr. Speaker, you may be aware of the fact that in this country at this time we're having a discussion about supply management. Do you know why supply management is even an issue? It's because we can outproduce our nation's ability to consume milk. We can produce more milk than our nation can consume. That is why supply management is an issue. That is why we've been discussing it. For example, I think it's the state of Wisconsin produces 30% more milk than that state can consume. 30% more milk than the state of Wisconsin can consume is the same amount of milk as all Canada consumes. So it goes to show that through modern technology, through the use of petroleum products, we are able to produce more food than the world is able to consume. And that's a good thing, Mr. Speaker. The very fact that we are able to live in a society where there's an abundance of food is unprecedented in history. The resource of food has always been a limiting factor on human flourishing. And so I would make the argument that petroleum products are a very good thing. And the very fact that we can bring them to the world, the fact that we have a wealth of them and we are able to ship them around the world is good for the entire world. We'll be able to feed the entire world based on the developments that we have used petroleum products for going forward. So I think that the argument for, especially for getting our petroleum products to Tidewater, is very important because in Canada here, I don't think there's not too many of us that are starving. In the Western world in particular, obesity is more of an issue than starvation. But in other parts of the world, across the oceans from this continent, starvation is still a reality. And I would make the argument, Mr. Speaker, that without the benefits of petroleum products in other parts of the world, agriculture will not be able to flourish. Without the benefits of petroleum product, healthcare will not be able to flourish. Without the benefits of petroleum products, transportation to get the product, to get the food that we need to the people that need it, will not happen. And so we need to be ensured that we understand when we are saying that a pipeline should not be built because it doesn't have social license. We have to understand that we are dealing with a product, petroleum product, that has the ability to lift everybody out of poverty, the ability to feed the world based on the way that we use petroleum products. And so, Mr. Speaker, I will argue that this pipeline most assuredly has social license, because the moral question of whether we can allow the world to starve or the world to eat is bound up in the question of, do we build a pipeline to Tidewater? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Peace River Westlock will have 3 minutes remaining in his speech when the House resumes debate after question period. Statements by members. Déclaration de député, l'honorable